The year was 1918, and in Lakewood, Ohio, a quiet bedroom community just outside of Cleveland, a wealthy oil tycoon named Elmer Hupp left his wife and daughter to go on a business trip. He was headed for Kansas City, Missouri, but upon reaching Chicago, Mr. Hupp had decided he didn't need to go to Kansas City after all. With this sudden change of heart, he turned around and headed home. Elmer Hupp climbed out of the taxi into the crisp winter night and looked up at his house. What he saw taking place in an upstairs bedroom window threw him into a rage, and by the next morning, Elmer Hupp would be famous for much more than drilling for oil. My name is Michael, and this is the story of a love triangle from over 100 years ago that ended with one man dead and the other man becoming something of a local hero. True crime can get pretty nasty, so I'd like to try something a little bit different with a murder that, in retrospect, seems kind of quaint. The full newspaper article from my thumbnail is available at grimsilence.com, and if you're interested in true crime that's a bit older and more obscure, but not usually this old and this obscure, please be sure to like and subscribe. 40-year-old Elmer Hupp was a man who had it all. The oil business had made him rich. He had a beautiful wife, a loving daughter, and a beautiful home. Thanks to the increasing popularity of the automobile and the petroleum demands of World War I, Elmer Hupp's Rushville Drilling and Producing Company was thriving. The Hupp family enjoyed preferred status in their community, rubbing elbows with society's elite. And it turns out that Mrs. Hupp was rubbing more than just elbows behind her husband's back. According to court testimony, Mr. Hupp's intention was to walk in the house, bid his wife and daughter farewell, and then retreat to a nearby hotel room where he would end his life. He had suspected that his dear wife was cheating on him yet again, a suspicion that was confirmed by an acquaintance, and Mr. Hupp was in deep despair. But upon getting out of the taxi, he glanced up and saw his wife through the bedroom window of the second floor. She was wearing a kimono, and she was with another man. The two lovers had forgotten to draw the shades, and their little rendezvous was apparently taking place in full view of anyone who happened to be standing in front of the house, as Mr. Hupp was. Here's how the Mansfield News reported the events of this fateful night. Lakewood's society set, the most fashionable in Cleveland, and in which all the principals in the Triangle tragedy were prominent, is stirred to the utmost by the story, only a few details of which were made public by the police. It is known, however, that the husband, returning home unexpectedly, observed through the undrawn shade the brightly lighted interior of his wife's richly furnished boudoir, saw two figures enter the room and recognized the man as his whilom friend, Charles L. Joyce. His wife, the story says, wore a kimono. It was some minutes before the frantic husband could effect entrance to his home. He rushed immediately to his wife's apartment, found her alone, now clad in a bathrobe and apparently near hysterics. Failing to find the intruder in the boudoir, Hupp searched the other rooms on the upper floor, eventually, it is said, locating Joyce hidden behind an armchair. Joyce refused to leave his refuge, and Hupp shot around the chair as best he could, firing 3 times before a bullet took fatal effect. Then he telephoned the police. Another newspaper described Mr. Hupp's condition as a red rage, stating that he rang the doorbell at the front of the house as a diversion and entered through the rear of the house to charge upstairs and ask his unusually attractive wife if she was alone. And then, after dispatching Charles Joyce with his pistol, he called the police and calmly explained, "This is Mr. Hupp of Lake Avenue. I believe I have just killed a man I found in my house." The next day, the Akron Beacon-Journal reported the following. Formal charges of murder against Elmer Hupp, wealthy oil promoter who late Friday night shot and killed Charles L. Joyce, also wealthy. A very important detail indeed. 35-year-old Charles Joyce, also wealthy as we now know, lived in a district known locally as the Millionaire Colony and worked in the clothing industry as a traveling salesman, and apparently a very successful one. News spread quickly about what had happened in the Hupp home on January 10th. It became widely known that Mr. Hupp had been arrested and was being held in the local jail as city officials decided whether he would be released on bail. As these tidbits of news broke, public support for Mr. Hupp surged. Sure, he had killed a man, but the man he killed was desecrating Elmer Hupp's home, and the public just wasn't having it. The police station was beset with numerous offers to put up bail money on behalf of Mr. Hupp, a man who had reportedly given his wife $100,000 as a Christmas gift just weeks before. Hupp certainly didn't need assistance with his bail, but local sentiment was firmly on his side. Offers of bail money came from Hupp's wealthy friends, and people who had never even met Hupp were also trying to come to his rescue. In all, over $1 million was offered in order to secure Hupp's release. The police finally decided that $35,000 would be enough, and both the president and the treasurer of the venerable United Banking and Savings Company walked into the police station to sign for Mr. Hupp's bail. Mrs. Hupp, who had to be mortified by this entire spectacle, with her cheating ways exposed to the entire community, said she wanted to help her husband beat the murder rap. She offered to testify on his behalf, but Hupp wouldn't allow it. Mr. Hupp's defense attorney insisted that Hupp's daughter, Consuela, absolutely had to testify. The 14-year-old girl could answer one very important question about what had been going on at home after Mr. Hupp had departed for Kansas City 2 days before the killing. Where was Charles Joyce during that time? Reporting indicated that he may have essentially moved himself into the master bedroom at the Hupp residence the moment Mr. Hupp left for his business trip, and if that was the case, then there was no way any jury would convict Hupp of murder due to what was then referred to as the unwritten law, which I'll explain in a bit. Mr. Hupp did not want his daughter testifying and aimed to keep her out of the trial at all costs. Instead of relying on the unwritten law, Hupp's defense strategy would be to plead insanity. Shortly before the trial, Charles Joyce's funeral was held at St. Aloysius Church in Cleveland. The newspapers reported that Joyce's mother was told that her son had died in a car accident. She was so distraught that she had been under the care of a physician ever since hearing of her beloved son's demise. Relatives exercised great care to keep the truth of his death from her, and hopefully they prevented her from reading any newspapers as well. Once the trial got underway, it was reported that over 1,000 local citizens packed the courtroom and the halls, although this sounds like it could be a bit of hyperbole. Nonetheless, everyone wanted to know what happened on the night that Elmer Hupp murdered Charles Joyce, and they wanted to hear it from Mr. Hupp himself. The trial was short but dramatic. Elmer Hupp sat in the witness chair as his attorney laid out his case. While this was going on, Consuela, Hupp's daughter, walked into the courtroom. She and her father locked eyes for a moment, and then both began sobbing. This moment would set the tone for much of Hupp's testimony. After friends and loved ones testified to Hupp's unimpeachable character and reputation, Elmer Hupp told his story. The courtroom was riveted as he described hearing about Mrs. Hupp's affair with a man in Pittsburgh, and how she knelt and prayed and begged Mr. Hupp to forgive her. Hupp described how he became so distraught that he threatened to end himself, and how his wife and daughter pounded on the door of the bathroom, begging him not to do the unthinkable, and how Mrs. Hupp vowed that she would never stray again. Of course, Mrs. Hupp did indeed stray when Charles Joyce came into the picture, and Hupp described his anguish upon finding his wife with Joyce several months earlier. He described how he went crazy and told Mrs. Hupp that he couldn't get along without her. Mr. Hupp told the courtroom that his only intention upon ending his business trip early was to take one last look at his wife and daughter before getting out of the way of Mrs. Hupp's happiness. Elmer Hupp's intention was to destroy himself so that his wife could live happily and his daughter without shame. Hupp's testimony had the courtroom in tears. Many women, and a few men as well, were weeping, and one woman was so overcome with emotion that she had to be helped out of the courtroom. The jury deliberated for about 2.5 hours and came back into the courtroom, which was tense with anticipation. Consuela gripped her father's hands and began to cry. Both trembled nervously. The court clerk took the verdict from the jury foreman and read the decision to the hushed audience. Not guilty. Friends and relatives rushed over to congratulate Mr. Hupp as father and daughter were locked in a long, tearful embrace. Simultaneously, spectators in the courtroom erupted with cheers of jubilation. After the judge confirmed that the entire jury was agreed on the verdict, the spectators cheered once again. With tears of gratitude streaming down her cheeks, young Consuela Hupp walked over to the jury box and shook the hand of each juror. Mr. Hupp himself followed and shook their hands as well. Jurors later said that they had decided in favor of Hupp's defense of emotional insanity. However, some newspapers declared it a victory for the unwritten law. In an article unrelated to Hupp's trial, the now-defunct Arizona newspaper, the Winslow Mail, described the unwritten law thusly. The unwritten law had its institution to safeguard the home even to the limit of killing the despoiler, and in such cases should always be sufficient defense to acquit any husband or wife of the crime of murder. In fact, it would be better for society if the gun was used more often in the defense of the sanctity of the home, and rid the community of the vultures whose lust hesitates at nothing. The unwritten law is to protect the wives and daughters, and it has divine sanction. Never mind the fact that this newspaper was advocating for more gun violence. What matters is that this unwritten law of early 1900s America basically gave unofficial license to all husbands and wives to murder any homewrecker they might find hiding behind an armchair. The early 20th century was obviously a wild time to be alive. Now, even though Mr. Hupp remained a free man after he was done murdering Charles Joyce, Joyce's family was not done with Mr. Hupp. Joyce's mother eventually did learn of her son's true fate, and she and her husband sued Mr. Hupp for the sum of $100,000. The lawsuit stated that Hupp deprived the aged parents of their sole means of support, which honestly sounds quite understandable. The lawsuit would eventually be settled for a paltry $5,500. About a week after the not guilty verdict, Hupp decided to divorce his two-timing wife, which, again, understandable. The family eventually moved to Texas, with Elmer Hupp living in San Antonio while Mrs. Hupp and their daughter Consuela lived in Dallas. After the divorce was finalized, Mr. Hupp almost immediately married the daughter of a Texas ranch owner. In 1919, Consuela, 16 years old at this point, married a soldier who had just come home from fighting the Great War in France. As for Mrs. Hupp, she may have gotten conned out of $30,000 by an investment fraudster, although it's possible that the victim could have been another Ethel Hupp from Cleveland who had $30,000 to spare in 1920. And thus ends the dramatic tale of Elmer Hupp and family. And if Mr. Hupp were to commit the same crime today, there is no doubt that he'd be looking at jail time, and it's probably a good thing that laws these days tend to be written down. I'd love to know your thoughts on this case, so please comment down below, and also, if you're not already subscribed, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching.